Hello everyone, and welcome to the Reserving Forum 2022. My name is Nikhil Shah, and I'm the Senior Manager for the Syndicate Reserving team at Lloyd's. And I'm also pleased to be joined today by some senior actuaries in the team, Hazal, Priye, and Uma, who will introduce themselves as we go through the presentation. Today, we wanted to talk you through some of our thoughts and findings and key areas to consider ahead of the year-end reserving. I will start with some opening comments just to set the scene and then hand over to the team to take you through the content from the agenda. It's been an eventful few years and one of the busiest times in recent history for actuaries generally, and potentially even more so for reserving actuaries. Starting with COVID-19 in 2020, followed by significant natural catastrophe events in 2021, such as Hurricane Ida and Storm Uri, and now with the 2022 trio of the invasion of Ukraine, material changes in the inflationary environment, and Hurricane Ian, with the US windstorm season still to finish. All of this needs to be considered alongside BAU reserving, with impacts determined on the reserves and relevant feedback loops to other teams around the business. If we focus on the 2022 events, we have set out our expectations for Ukraine reserving in guidance issued earlier this year in April, followed by inflation reserving guidance in June. Our overarching expectation for these is that syndicates are taking a balanced, well-informed approach to reserving for these areas and are being transparent and explicitly clear with their boards about the uncertainties and what is captured within the best estimate reserves versus the margin. We fully appreciate this is easier said than done, but the answer is not to do nothing, nor is it to put excessive prudence in the reserves. Then, more recently, turning to Hurricane Ian, that is more of a type of catastrophe and uncertainty event that the market is used to dealing with. But we do know that there are specifics about this event, such as the slow-moving nature of the hurricane and extent of the storm surge and flooding, that will make it more complex. Through this presentation, we will look to share some of our findings from Lloyd's returns and our own analysis of market-level reserves in order to provide you with some insights on what is observable at market level to take into account for your own year-end reserving. With that in mind, I'll now hand over to the team to take you through our thoughts ahead of the year end on these key topics. Hazal, over to you.
Thanks, Nikhil. So my name is Hazal Karakut and I'm a senior actuary in the reserving modelling team at Lloyd's. Today I'll be sharing the results of our global central reserving exercise. So as those of you who have been to one of these sessions in previous years will know that at Lloyd's we carry out an independent reserve review at the total market level, where net written reserves are projected by year of account and Lloyd's class of business. And this is based on the technical provisions data provided by syndicates. This exercise is relatively independent of syndicates' aggregated reserve estimates and utilises Lloyd's market-wide data. Access to this type of data gives us a bird's eye view and enables us to identify market trends which can be difficult to obtain at syndicate level. The primary aim of this review is to compare our view with the market to validate that the market's best estimate reserves at an aggregate market level are likely to be sufficient, as well as identifying potential areas of concern to drive market investigations and oversight. Our latest review was based on the 2021 year-end data, and in the next few slides, I'll be sharing the key conclusions from this year's exercise. So the good news is that overall market's best estimate reserves continue to be in excess of our independent aggregate view. However, concerns at class level continue in some areas. The chart on this slide is showing the difference between our view and the market as a percentage of net best estimate reserves by Lloyd's high-level class of business. The blue bars are showing where we think the market's best estimate reserves are higher than our independent view, whereas the dark orange bars are where we think the market's reserves are lower than our view and should potentially be considered for reserve sufficiency. So starting with the first bar, Our view for accident and health continues to be higher than the market, and the gap has not really changed this year. The main contributing classes are accident and health, direct, and pecuniary. This difference in view has been present for a number of years now, and the main driver for the difference is that markets estimates allow an element of gap between the historical experience versus what is assumed for recent year loss ratios. Therefore, we require the market to actively monitor any divergences from historical trends and continue to be able to support this gap based on experience on the recent history. Moving over to casualty, concerns over casualty FinPro remain on most classes despite strengthening over the past year. Casualty FinPro classes have been a focus area for the last few years, where market reserves have been lower than our view. This gap has increased slightly since 2020 year end, where the market continues to have a much more favourable outlook in relation to the recent years. This will continue to be a key area of focus for next year, and I will also go into a bit more detail later on in this presentation. Moving on from casualty, I'd like to get your attention on energy. Although there continues to be an overall surplus on energy high-level class of business, this has reduced significantly this year, mainly due to energy onshore liability. Both the market and our view of the reserve requirements for this class have increased due to poor claims experience. But the potential deficit has grown as the Lloyd's view has increased more than the market on recent years of account in particular. This is a class which we would like to understand further over the next year. Finally, on this graph, you can see a very small orange bar. So our view of the property DNF reserves are now slightly above the market view, driven by the binder business. However, this is likely to be due to our CAT data limitations, where there's an element of misallocation for existing CAT reserves between property DNF and treaty classes. Overall, this is an area of less concern for now, as there are still sufficient reserves across the two high-level classes. So all in all, although the overall results of our exercise is showing very similar results compared to previous years, it is even more crucial to ensure the differences in views are understood, justified and actioned given the fast-changing reserving landscape we're seeing recently. Therefore, it's very important that reserving assumptions are made by carefully considering history and allowing appropriately for areas where future may differ from the past. Next slide, please. So following on from the last slide, I'd like to highlight the gap on the casualty FinPro classes has increased slightly this year. The graph on the left-hand side is showing a breakdown of the casualty FinPro reserves by low-level class of business compared to the market view. The red bars indicate places where market reserves are lower than our independent view. As you can see, almost all classes show red bars, with the largest being on D&O, cyber and FI classes of business. There has been some reserve strengthening in the market on older years of account, which has reduced the differences on those years, but the gap on recent years continue to counteract that. The main driver for the gap on recent years of account is where market is assuming significantly lower loss ratios compared to historical experience. The graph on the right is showing how the market loss ratios have developed by year of account over time. It can be seen that market's view has increased from the initial estimates and SPF every year on all years of account, bringing it closer to the MRC view. Although MRC view of reserves has not been perfect as well, as we're quite far from the actual details of the business features. For example, we're not able to make any allowance for things like remediation actions. Nevertheless, market's historical loss ratio development highlights that we have no reason to believe that the loss ratios on recent years will not continue to deteriorate, which questions ILR and planning loss ratio assumptions on these years. A lot of work has gone into investigating the differences in the past, but given what we've seen in the past, combined with the increased uncertainties due to the fast-changing economic environment, we'll continue to monitor this gap and ensure appropriate assumptions are set for the recent years of account. This will, of course, be a combined effort. We therefore expect syndicates to provide appropriate justification for assumptions used and consider carefully how they have reflected past and future expectations. In particular, careful consideration, challenge and justifications on the remediation allowed for in recent years and the evidence of it is required. Risk-adjusted rate change has also been a significant factor in recent years of account where reliance has been put. Syndicates need to ensure that RARC assumptions are validated for reserving purposes. Lastly, inflation assumptions should be appropriately reserved for and wider economic uncertainties should be considered. I will not go into too much detail on this as Priya will provide further insight into uncertainties and inflation reserving later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Moving on, unsurprisingly, we thought cyber continues to deserve its own separate slide. This class has seen rapid growth at Lloyd's in the last 10 years and has become one of the top 5 largest classes. As we all know, it's been performing poorly in recent years due to heavy loss experience globally, mainly as a result of significant increase in the number of ransomware attacks. These increases and rapid deterioration on other large losses was causing a lot of concern on 2019 and 2020 years in particular. Since then, there has been pricing improvements and we have seen strong risk-adjusted rate change on this class to counteract the poor experience in recent years. However, there continues to be a high level of uncertainty around sufficiency of the RARC to justify a performance improvement. When comparing to our view, there continues to be a big gap between MRC and market reserves for cyber. The bars on the chart here is showing market loss ratios by year of account broken down by paid, outstanding and IBNR components, and the red line represents our view of the loss ratio by year of account. As we can see from this, our view is higher on all years of account, where largest differences being on more recent years of account. The gap has grown this year as we've placed less reliance on the RARC improvements in recent years due to the uncertainties caused as well as not having enough historical data. This class was a focus area last year and we had various discussions with the market throughout the year to understand the drivers of this. Although we acknowledge that the gap between the views could be caused by the differences in methodology, syndicates are required to be careful to continue to have best practice reserving techniques and have very robust estimates given the size and the uncertainties underlying this class. Syndicates are required to understand the drivers of the growth in the account and challenge assumptions on recent years of account by considering things like the rating environment. Is the rate increase seen sufficient to cover expected claims or any new types of claims? They should consider risk of increased lack of expertise with the increase in premium volumes and the new entrants to the market. Other things to consider are changing risk profiles, data issues and credibility, claims inflation, increase in frequency and severity of claims, for example, due to BI exposures, concentration risk, and appropriateness of historical development patterns given the changes in risk profile and the uncertainties we've just mentioned. Next slide, please. As mentioned in the first slide, for energy, there has been a significant reduction in the reserve surplus suggested by our independent reserve review at 2021 year end. The primary driver was energy onshore liability. Both Lloyd's and market view of reserve requirements for this class have increased due to poor claims experience, but the potential difference between Lloyd's independent view and the market reserves has grown, as our view has increased more than the market on recent years of account in particular. This class has been loss-making since 2011 with continued unfavourable experience. Our independent assumptions have been strengthened to reflect the recent development. On the other hand, the market continues to hold very low loss ratios on more recent years of account. We understand that this class has seen significant remediation in recent years. However, experience has continued to be poor as well. Given this, we would like syndicates to be able to justify the low loss ratios in recent years. They should consider whether full benefit of remediations be taken into account in planning and reserving loss ratios until we see evidence in performance. Secondly, this class is likely to be impacted by social inflation and climate change. We therefore require syndicates to carefully consider these when reserving. Also, attention is required on the tail of the development patterns to allow for possibility of late development seen in the historical experience, as well as the recent changes in the book and exposures. Next slide, please. So far, we've mainly been focusing on specific classes, but that's not to say that other classes are not impacted by the fast evolving reserving landscape that we're seeing recently. There's a lot going on in the world at the moment, which we may not have seen in the historical experience we hold. As Nikhil mentioned, this is making our traditional reserving methods less reliable. We therefore require syndicates to look out for a number of things. Firstly, assumption setting in recent years and appropriate justification is crucial for all classes given the major new changes in the market. Validation of RARC assumptions used for reserving is also required in order to ensure that RARC increases result in a realistic expected loss ratio. Climate change also needs to be considered. This would involve allowing for the impact of climate change on losses, as well as how any transition risk might affect the reserves. You should also be on the lookout for any new types of risks that you may not have anticipated covering when setting reserves or when writing the business. And changes in economic environment, including increases in economic inflation, social inflation, and how potential post-Ukraine recession would impact reserves need to be considered and allowed for. Finally, tail length should also be reviewed for classes where the mentioned issues are likely to impact. I know that these things are easier said than done, but we need to constantly remind ourselves that given the highly uncertain times, any significant reserving assumption we make needs to be backed up with significant justification in order to minimize the risk of getting it wrong. I will now hand over to Priya to talk a bit more about the key uncertainties and inflation reserving.
Thanks, Azal. Hello, everyone. My name is Priya Kanabar, and I am a senior actuary in the syndicate reserving team at Lloyd's. So the first section I'm going to be talking to you about is the key reserving uncertainties that assigning actuaries and reserving actuaries across the market should be considering ahead of this year end. So before we talk about the 2022 year end uncertainties, it's worth just taking a step back and reminding ourselves of what's actually happened over the last couple of years. So what I've got here on the slide is the table is showing you the category 3 wordings and category 4 wordings that were received at 2020 year end and at 2021 year end to suggest the overall level of uncertainty at an aggregate level on the market reserves. So if we look at the columns on the right, that's showing you the 2020 year end wording 3 and wording 4s. And in the middle column is showing you the 2021 year end wording 3 and wording 4 categories. Now, when you look at the wording 4s, that's been consistent to last year in terms of to the previous year in terms of the number of wordings, so that's remained at 5. But if you look at wording 3s, that's reduced from 36 to 33. Now, if you look at the split by event, that provides a clearer picture in terms of what's actually happened in terms of level of uncertainty. So at 2020 year end, the 36 wordings were dominated by COVID-19. So specifically, COVID-19 received 23 wording 3s. And that makes sense if you think about the level of uncertainty that was around COVID-19 at the time, particularly given the uncertainty around the duration of the pandemic and also the associated responses from various governments across the world. In 2021, the number of wordings reduced from 23 down to 9 for COVID-19. Again, that makes sense given that there was a lot more clarity around various sources of uncertainty 12 months down the line. For 2021 year end, the reduction in COVID-19 wordings was largely offset by wording threes in respect of Hurricane Ida, which received 11 wording threes at 2021 year end. Now, it's worth noting that Hurricane Ida does not, the uncertainty around Hurricane Ida was not believed to be in excess of what is expected for an event of that nature at that stage of the development. The other consequence of the shift from heavily dominated by COVID in 2020 year end to a more balance between COVID-19 and Hurricane Ida 2021 year end is the impact on years of account. So the wording threes in respect of COVID-19 were split across multiple years of account, and particularly 2019 and 2020 years of account, whereas Hurricane Ida 2021 year end, all the wordings in respect of that event were in respect of 2021 year of account. So moving on to 2022 year end uncertainties. Now on the slide, we've got various uncertainties that are market-wide and syndicate actuaries and signing actuaries should be considering when they do their reserving this year end. However, this list is by no means exhaustive, and syndicate specific sources of uncertainties in particular need to be considered when conducting the reserving exercises. A lot of the other items listed on this slide will be covered later on in the presentation, such as COVID-19, Ukraine, inflation and Hurricane Ian, so I won't dwell on them at this stage. But the one thing that is worth mentioning at this stage is that we all need to be mindful of the current economic landscape, which is constantly changing, and the possibility of recession driven by the energy crisis and consequently the impact it's having on the interest rates and FX rates for all major currencies. And these are all interlinked in one way or another, and it can be quite complicated to understand the impact of these factors on the reserves, and therefore actuaries should take the time to really have proactive conversations with the wider business, particularly class underwriters, to understand how these factors will affect different parts of the book in different ways. So moving on to inflation, which is everyone's favorite topic this year. Now, I appreciate inflation has been extensively covered by many presentations over the past few months, not just by Lloyd's, but also by others. But I feel it's important to touch on some of the general background, just to emphasize why inflation is still a concern for us and why it deserves to receive the attention that we are requesting actuaries give it this year end. So the graph on the left in the slide shows the expected forecast of CPI by Bank of England. Now, the key point that I want to draw your attention to is at the end of this year, Bank of England forecasts the CPI to be around 13%. There are also a couple of other figures on this slide. So Goldman Sachs, for example, came out and said that CPI in the UK could reach 22% by early 2023, depending on how energy prices move. Citi have also forecasted a materially higher number, so they forecasted 18% for UK inflation by first quarter of 2023. Again, dependent on how some of the factors move. Now, of course, claims inflation definitely does not equal CPI, and claims inflation should be considered by thinking about the drivers of claims specifically for that syndicate and thinking about the book of business and the risk profile the syndicate writes, and then thinking about what might be the appropriate inflation indices to consider. But given the wide range of possible outcomes in terms of economic inflation, what is clear is that actuaries need to continue to make progress in terms of the thinking they're doing around inflation, and ensuring that the processes that they're developing are appropriately allowing for the complex nature of inflation. The other thing to really highlight, given the wide range, is that the communication to the board really does need to draw out this level of uncertainty. So it's important that the board understands what the impact on the reserves for a syndicate might be based on various different scenarios. And it's also important for them to understand what the likelihood is of each of the scenarios occurring. This is so they get a full picture and complete context around the uncertainty with regards to inflation. Now, we appreciate that actually thinking about how the current inflationary environment might impact the syndicate is not a straightforward task by any means. And so we hope that the output that has been shared by Lloyd's over the past few months has helped the market in some way to tackle this complex issue. Earlier on in the year, the Lloyd's reserving team conducted a thematic review on inflation, and specifically around social inflation and economic inflation and how they are considered as part of reserving. The findings from this review were shared with the market via an LMAC presentation in July, and this was then further followed with a publication of the report which included findings from the thematic review. It also provided best practices and best practices that we'd observed as part of the review, as well as some recommendations that we as Lloyd's were making to following our findings from the review. This report was published in August 2022. In June 2022, Lloyd's published a reserving guidance which was specifically focused on inflation, and this outlined the expectations Lloyd's has of syndicates, and it also provided possible approaches that syndicates could utilize in order to help meet those expectations, and some considerations that syndicates should be making when thinking about inflation. This was then followed up with a presentation to the NEDs later that month, just to really emphasize and summarize the expectations that Lloyd's has of syndicates. So talking about these expectations, so this slide here, I appreciate this. Many of you will have seen this slide in some of the previous presentations that Lloyd's has conducted in the last few months, but I feel it's important to share this again, if nothing, then at least as a reminder of what these expectations are, and in particular for signing actuaries, I feel it's important for them to be aware of these as they conduct their work this year end. So just to really summarize what those expectations are, we do expect syndicates to be considering the impact of inflation explicitly on their book of business, and make allowances that reflect the specificities of individual classes of business. The approach should be tailored to their risk profile. We do not expect syndicates to throw the kitchen sink at it. At the same time, we expect them to make a considered approach. Now, we touched on in one of the earlier slides that CPI, for example, could reach 13% according to Bank of England. So the answer in that case would not be to uplift all the reserves by 13%. It's also important that syndicates really think about not just the classes of business, but also the geography they write in. So, for example, given the properties in the US are predominantly made from timber, they're likely to be highly exposed to the price changes in timber. Whereas in the UK, given the properties are predominantly made from brick, they're likely to be less exposed to the prices of timber. The other key expectation and the key point is for syndicates to be really clear about the approach they're using to allow for inflation, and to be very clear about the approach to the stakeholders as well. And the key reason for this is so that stakeholders can provide appropriate challenge to the approach that's been adopted, and therefore the allowances that are coming out of the approach are as robust as they can be. So what does the Lloyd's oversight look like? So over the next couple of slides, I'll be talking about where we focused our oversight over the last few months, and also touch on what we're expecting to focus on over the coming few months. So as I mentioned earlier, we'd conducted a thematic review earlier on in the year. Now, while the review was quite early on in the year, and therefore when we were discussing with syndicates, a lot of them were at very early stages of their thinking around inflation. The review was very useful in helping us formulate the guidance that we issued to the market in June. Since then, our oversight has focused on ensuring that syndicates are setting reserves in line with the guidance. To help us assist with this oversight, we've requested syndicates to provide information alongside the QMA return at Q2, which focused on inflation. And we also asked syndicates to provide further information as part of the focus area return, which syndicates are submitting alongside the capital returns. We completely understand that actually requesting all this additional information has added significantly to the reporting burden of reserving actuaries across the market. And we haven't taken this decision lightly. We really do appreciate all the effort that syndicates have put in to do this. And just like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to everyone that's been involved in providing this information. We will be sharing some information, some output and key themes that have come out from our review of the QMA work later on in the slides. So hopefully you will find that interesting and insightful and can consider that as part of your work going forwards. Given the complexities around consideration of inflation and the fact that actually reserving actuaries haven't really had to think about inflation in this level of detail for the past few decades, really, we understand that the processes syndicates come up with may take some time to embed into the reserving process and to ensure that the process fully aligns with the guidance that Lloyd set out in June. However, given the importance of the Q2 reserves to the capital setting process, we have focused our oversight over the last few months in ensuring that the reserves being set and utilised for capital setting purposes are appropriately allowing for the current environment. Following the capital setting season, our focus is going to move to ensuring that syndicates have sufficiently enhanced their processes and consideration of inflation ahead of Q4 2022 reserving exercises. And to help us do this, following consultation with many signing actuaries across the market, we've introduced a new return for signing actuaries to complete this year end. On the slide, I've got a screenshot of the main aspect of the new return. What the screenshot is showing you is essentially a table which asks for explicit inflation allowance by reporting year, gross and net. And this is explicit inflation allowance made by the signing actuary for 2022 Q4 reserves, as well as the best estimate allowance that the syndicate has made for the inflation at the same point in time. Just to be clear about what we mean by explicit in this case, we are asking for any allowances and adjustments made to reserves, either via adjustments or otherwise, which captures the effect of inflation on claims beyond what is expected to be implicitly covered within historical claims experience. So this could be, for example, uplifts to IBNRs, or it could be, as another example, explicit uplifts to future cash flows. And to be very clear about what we mean by best estimate reserves, we are asking for the impact on the earned and unearned reserves. In the return, signing actuaries will find a box for comments, and in there we expect signing actuaries to comment upon material drivers of material differences in allowances between what the signing actuaries have made versus what the syndicate has made. We expect these comments to be briefs, given that we expect greater detail to be included in the report. In the report, we also expect signing actuaries to describe the approach they've adopted when thinking about the allowances to make for inflation, and also any differences in the approach between approach that they've adopted versus the approach that the syndicates have adopted, and therefore what the possible implication is on the level of allowances calculated. Now, moving on to some of the key things that we have observed as part of our review of the QMA work. Once again, to reiterate that actually receiving all this information has been very helpful to us, and it's been very, very encouraging to see that actually a significant amount of progress has been made by the market as a whole in a very short space of time around a topic which is very difficult to get our heads around. What we've got on the slide here are some of the stats that we think the audience will find useful to be aware of. So 90% of the syndicates as at Q2 made an explicit consideration for the impact of inflation on their reserves. 65% of the syndicates went on to make an explicit adjustment to their reserves at Q2. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got some percentages which show really the approaches that were taken by the 65% to make allowances for inflation at Q2. 37% of the syndicates considered the impact on inflation based on future cash flows and uplifting them based on their view of inflation. 35% of the syndicates considered inflation by uplifting ILRs to allow for the current inflationary environment. 11% of the syndicates adopted a combination of those two approaches. 5% of the syndicates adopted other methods, an example of that being inflation-adjusted chain ladder. And finally, 12% of the syndicates adopted a combination of the uplift to ILRs as well as other approaches. Now, while a significant amount of progress has been made by the market, there is still a lot of work to be done. 25% of the syndicates received feedback from Lloyd's following our review of the QMA. This was to highlight concerns and areas of feedback we had based on the information they provided to us as part of the QMA. Now, the common themes around the feedback that we provided were specifically in respect of syndicates that mentioned they'd adopted the ILR uplift approach, but where they had failed to explain to us how they'd got comfort around older years of accounts where the ILR was not utilised as part of the reserving approach and where there was a material amount of outstanding reserves remaining. Another example of common theme of feedback excuse me, was around syndicates who had understandably taken a pragmatic, maybe a top-down approach to thinking about the impact of inflation on the reserves at Q2. We made clear in our feedback that we actually expect them to revisit their allowance based on a ground-up, a bottom-up consideration of inflation by actually thinking about the drivers at a class of business level. As the slide shows, and given you are all actuaries, you won't need me to kind of say, but I'll say it anyway, 10% of the syndicates actually did not make explicit consideration for the impact of inflation. And to be very clear, by the end of this year, in time for Q4 2022, we do expect 100% of the syndicates to explicitly consider inflation. Additionally, we expect syndicates where an explicit adjustment has not been made to reserves to provide a very strong justification as to why that is appropriate. As Lloyd's, we do expect majority of the classes to be impacted by inflation, albeit to varying degrees. But in the instance where an adjustment is not made, once again, we do expect very strong justification for why that is appropriate. And finally, for this slide, 64% of the syndicates indicated that they plan to enhance their consideration of inflation by the time they start their reserving exercise for Q4 2022. So this is the final slide from me, and what this slide is showing on the left-hand side, you've got a scatter chart which essentially shows the net uplift, the uplift to net reserves due to the allowances for inflation made at Q2 by syndicates. The x-axis represents the number of syndicates, and the y-axis represents the percentage uplift to net reserves. The key message from this slide is that actually the average uplift in net reserves at Q2 was 2.3% by syndicates. However, we should not be anchoring to that 2.3%. And there are many reasons for that. For example, as you may have noticed, there are many syndicates who are sitting on the x-axis, and this is because either they had not made an allowance for an explicit allowance for inflation, or because they had made an allowance but they were unable to quantify this at Q2. Additionally, you can see that there is a wide range of allowances made by syndicates at Q2, and this is something we would expect given the varying levels of risk profiles that are written across the market. And this is precisely the point. Syndicates need to be considering their own risk profiles and making an allowance that is appropriate to them. On the right-hand side of the slides, we've got some points which signing actuaries should really consider as part of their work this year end. Again, I appreciate this is a repetition of a point I made in the previous slide, but it is important to re-emphasize that sufficient justification is expected where allowances have not been made, and allowances need to consider the risk profile of the syndicate. Secondly, the economic landscape has evolved and continues to evolve at such a rapid pace that actually the assumptions that were set at Q2 may no longer be appropriate at Q4 and therefore may require revisiting. Some syndicates, as part of their Q2 response, had indicated that they were comfortable with the level of allowance within their margin for inflation. Just to be clear, we do expect allowances to be made to the best estimate where appropriate, given the implication and the impact of this to the capital setting, as well as then thinking about if any additional adjustment needs to be made to the margin. And finally, linking back to one of the first points I made at the start of this section, scenario testing would be a very powerful way of communicating uncertainty and the possible range of outcomes to the board. And again, just to re-emphasize the point I made earlier on, it's important that the board understands the possible impact on reserves under different scenarios, as well as the likelihood of those scenarios occurring. So to wrap up from me, there has been a significant amount of progress made by the market as a whole over a short space of time, but there remains a significant amount of work yet to be done. And Lloyd's will be focusing going forwards just to ensure that the approaches taken by the syndicates and the allowances made by the syndicates for inflation are in line with the guidance set out by Lloyd's. And to be able to do this, we will need the support of signing actuaries. So thank you very much, and I will now pass over to Uma.
Thanks, Priya. Next slide, please. So my name is Uma Devekar, and I am a senior actuary in the actuarial oversight team at Lloyd's. So moving on from inflation, the next area that we'd like to talk to you about is the situation in Ukraine. And just to flag, some of these messages you may have heard already in previous market presentations from us. So we are in the midst of a humanitarian crisis here, and the extent of this is still very much unknown. But we'd like to start with a few key points from a Lloyd's perspective. So firstly, the financial loss associated with the event is expected to be manageable for the Lloyd's market, with the net reserves estimated to be £1.1 billion as at Q2. Our analysis to date, it reinforces our view that all scenarios fall within manageable tolerances. And at this stage, we don't expect this to be a solvency or a capital event for the corporation or for individual syndicates. Booked reserves to date are nearly all IBNR, and the loss, it's concentrated in a few classes. So the aviation, marine, political risks, political violence, and trade credit classes. However, there are a lot of challenges around the loss estimates given, and given that the situation is still unfolding and there's a lot of complexity around the potential outcomes. Therefore, a high degree of uncertainty will persist when assessing the potential economic outcomes of this crisis. So on the next few slides, I'll talk about some of these uncertainties. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the main uncertainties we're seeing at the moment. So we've broadly split these into two areas: class level uncertainties and other uncertainties. So firstly, the estimates of losses by class are highly uncertain, with potential new losses to emerge and existing losses difficult to establish. Booked reserves to date, as I mentioned before, are nearly all IBNR, with only very few notifications. For all classes, the ongoing nature of the crisis makes loss estimates uncertain, and as well as this, there's the evolving sanctions. It's also difficult to foresee. So, for example, for trade credit policies, where are Russian companies likely to be able to deliver on their obligations, and where is this not the case? The length of the conflict will also be important. For example, for marine war losses, where ships are generally written off after having been stranded for 12 months. It's also clear that the complexity of the aviation loss in particular, it's almost without precedent in terms of the potential outcomes and interpreting how coverage might respond. This is really the class where we consider there to be the greatest uncertainty, and as such, we expect this to be a key area of focus for both signing actuaries and chief actuaries for this year end. Another key area of uncertainty is outwards reinsurance. Reinsurance default and dispute risks might be heightened, and as well as this, many of the event covers which are potentially impacted contain hours clauses, and there is uncertainty around the application of these clauses. So outwards reinsurance is another area where we'd expect signing actuaries and chief actuaries to focus their attention. And there are also the general economic uncertainties we're facing, with significant impacts on the agriculture, energy and mineral markets, and obviously the impacts on inflation. Next slide, please. In this slide, we've set out the areas that we as Lloyds think syndicates should take into consideration with respect to Ukraine reserving. So firstly, syndicates should remember to consider both direct and indirect losses, and where possible, these should be considered explicitly. If instead allowance is held as part of the general IBNR, you should think about the rationale as to why this is sufficient and appropriate. Consider the need to make allowance for the uncertainties mentioned before, in particular, the future nature and geographical scope of the event, potential supply chain impacts and geopolitical uncertainty, inflation effects, and uncertainty around outwards reinsurance. And just a reminder that as per usual, reporting should comply with UK GAAP and Solvency II requirements as applicable. In particular, the Solvency II estimate is a mean best estimate of all possible outcomes, and this should correspond to a probability weighted average. In addition, remember to allow for unearned losses. And finally, there should be appropriate governance around the Ukraine loss held. Allowances for Ukraine within reserve should be appropriately discussed and challenged at board level, especially given how much uncertainty there is around these assumptions. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to give you an update on recent COVID-19 developments and outline at a high level our key focus areas and remaining uncertainties. So as you'll be aware, since Q2 2020, Lloyd's has been collecting additional information from the markets on COVID, and this has been alongside the quarterly monitoring returns. This really has been to help support our understanding of COVID loss estimates, as well as the related uncertainties. But as time has progressed, the level of uncertainty surrounding COVID losses has changed, and as such, we focused our questions to the market on the areas where we consider there to still be some uncertainty. So during 2022, we really tried to reduce the amount of information requested from the market. This has given the general stability of the COVID loss reported to Lloyd's, whilst also recognising that the market is facing more prominent issues with the current Ukraine crisis and the highly uncertain inflationary environment. So at Q3, we are not requesting any additional information in respect of COVID, and we're still considering what information we'll ask for at Q4, although it will be focused on whatever uncertainties remain. Next slide. Oh, we're on the same slide, that's fine. This slide shows the progression of ultimate net of reinsurance loss estimates reported to Lloyd's for COVID. So since Q1 22, the net loss estimate has decreased from 3.5 to 3.2 billion. Similarly, there's been a slight decrease in the gross loss estimate from 5.9 billion to 5.8 billion. Generally, the level of uncertainty in the loss estimate has continued to reduce. So over the last 2 years, we've been closely monitoring 4 key areas. And now 2 out of the 4 key areas, we actually think to have the lowest level of uncertainty. So firstly, the uncertainty around the ongoing nature of the event and assumptions regarding timeframes. So any future variants that could lead to an uptick in COVID cases are not expected to materially impact the COVID loss estimates. And secondly, insufficient consideration of wider recessionary impacts. So with this, syndicates are generally moving away from explicit COVID recessionary impact allowances, and instead they're estimating the impact of any potential economic downturn as part of their general reserves, as really it's now less clear that economic impacts will be directly attributable to COVID itself. In terms of the 2 other areas where there still remains uncertainty, so there still remains some uncertainty on the legal challenge around application of wording. We are continuing to monitor this in light of developments in legal cases, and that includes appeal outcomes that are currently ongoing. And we'd expect this to be an area of focus for both signing actuaries and chief actuaries for those syndicates that are affected. With appeals being inevitable following formal court proceedings, we expect the remaining uncertainty to be appropriately reflected within reserves as at year end. But the key area of focus that we believe to have the highest level of uncertainty at this stage is outwards reinsurance. Although the reinsurance recovery ratio itself has been relatively stable, so at Q2 it's 44% of the gross loss, only 43% of the recoveries have been received to date. For Lloyd's outwards reinsurance team, so we've increased engagement with managing agents, and in particular, we're actively engaging with managing agents reporting material levels of aged debt. But similarly, it's important to ensure similar levels of engagement with outwards RI teams within syndicates when setting your year-end reserves, and to ensure that any allowance for reinsurance IBNR can be appropriately justified. Next slide, please. This slide highlights the net IBNR by class of business as reported within the 2022 Q2 return. So as you can see from the graph on the left, and this graph looks at the proportion of net IBNR of the total loss, this proportion is highest for property treaty. And this has mainly been driven by slow development of incurred claims, as well as uncertainty in respect of BI cases. Other drivers of IBNR are longer-tailed classes, specific events, uncertainty around reinsurance recoveries, and prudence. So around this point around prudence was particularly notable on the casualty classes as a reason for holding IBNR, where this is in respect of potential economic downturn. So as I mentioned before, as the economic environment is now less driven by COVID than by other more recent factors, some syndicates are moving IBNR from their COVID reserves and into a more general reserve. And although we feel that maintaining reserves in respect of economic downturn losses is important at the current time, we're also keen that syndicates understand what allowances they've made for the various different uncertainties, as firstly, this is key to ensuring that the most appropriate level of IBNR is held for all uncertainties, and secondly, this also allows for future monitoring. Next slide, please. Next slide after that. So now moving on to Hurricane Ian, starting with the trajectory of the hurricane. So after causing significant damage in Cuba, Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida on the 28th of September as a slow-moving Category 4 hurricane. Then it weakened to a tropical storm, strengthened over the Atlantic, before making landfall in South Carolina as a Category 1 hurricane. As you may expect, there's currently significant uncertainty, and there's a wide range of loss estimates being quoted by the insurance press at the moment. But we are likely to have firmer estimates in the next couple of weeks from model vendors, and also as a result of damage assessment. It is going to take time to understand the size of the loss. In particular, a significant element of the damage is expected to be caused by flooding, which is as a result of extreme rainfall and storm surge. And it may also take some time to distinguish between flood damage and wind damage. In addition to the property damage class, a few other classes need to be considered. So firstly, contingency for cancellation of events in the aftermath, but also travel disruption with closure of airports, as well as marine hull and cargo. One component that will push the loss higher and make the loss size even more uncertain is our favourite friend, inflation, which in the current economic environment could have a very large impact. So this is something that needs to be watched carefully, and you need to get comfortable that it's being appropriately allowed for in order to avoid loss creep and deterioration in reserves over time. Given the timing, rather than issuing a major claims return, we've chosen to collect information from syndicates via the Q3 additional QMA return template, and this will continue to include information requests on inflation and Ukraine. As mentioned earlier, in order to prioritise reporting and reduce market burden where we reasonably can, we've dropped the COVID request for this quarter, but we will be asking for some COVID information again as part of the Q4 return. I'll now hand over back to Nikhil for some final remarks.
Thanks, Uma. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, it's a tough year with lots of uncertainty to deal with. But this is where we as actuaries come into our own and really add value. As a reminder, our expectation is that each area of uncertainty is explicitly allowed for, such that there is a good understanding of what allowances are contained within the best estimate reserves to enable effective monitoring over time. This should be coupled with clear communication to your boards of best estimate allowances and the ranges or scenarios around these to really demonstrate the uncertainty. In addition to that general expectation, there are 4 key takeaways that I want to leave you with. Firstly, we expect that for key uncertainties, you will take a probabilistic approach to reserving, taking into account possible or probable outcomes. And in practice, this can mean applying probabilities to various scenarios, and we have seen this done well by some syndicates in respect of Ukraine loss estimates in particular. Additionally, we expect that the change in inflation will impact all syndicates, albeit to different extents, and there should be explicit consideration and allowances made by 100% of syndicates by year end. Casualty FinPro lines of business continues to be an area of concern for Lloyd's, and we expect actuaries to validate that the reserving assumptions appropriately reflect historical experience and future expectations. Please do take into account the insights that we've shared with you on the trends we see at market level that may be relevant to your business, but just not visible at syndicate level. And finally, it's really important that we go back to first principles and really challenge ourselves this year end, not to turn the handle in the thick of all the workload, but rather take the time to focus on the material areas and understand exactly what assumptions we are relying on within our approaches, which won't always be our own assumptions. You need to be clear on exactly what assumptions are being relied upon in your reserve setting especially those that aren't your assumptions, but contribute to your reserves. Because there is a risk that if these are overlooked, that the reserves may be inappropriate. Thank you very much for listening. We do hope you found this session useful and would very much welcome any feedback you have. Thanks again and goodbye.